Okay, so today I'm going to be making a tier list on what healing specs are the best for each status of the game. Because I've been seeing a lot of people saying like, "Oh, this spec is dead, this spec is dead," which are actually genuinely untrue for the healing specs. But I've seen a lot of people get demoralized and demotivated on their class, which I feel like if it's misinformation that's kind of making you feel that way, then that's not right. So here I am. I've played all the healing specs in the game since beta, and I've been speaking with a lot of people who play their classes. I've been doing a lot of research on all these classes. So I'm going to give you guys my as accurate as possible tier list on these classes. So the first list I'm going to start off with is pug groups, like pickup groups. And the difference between is pug groups are typically the most unorganized groups where you never know what you're getting into when you're joining these teams. You could have really not the greatest players, or you could have a really good player in the team, but you never really know. But for pug groups, the best healer is always a DPS healer because you need to be able to contribute that damage. Because these teams vary so much in how the DPS do, you're never gonna be able to reliably have a good DPS that it's worth buffing for. Because typically buffing one DPS is probably not going to be more beneficial than doing your own damage, where you can out DPS maybe two or three or even the whole team. I've seen people DPS the whole team. So like the best class in a pug group is actually Dissonance, and then after Dissonance is followed by Smite. And after Smite is followed by Lifebind. And then after Lifebind is followed by Concerto. Now, the reason that Dissonance is actually like the best pug healer is because Dissonance basically, like in short, just does the most damage. And because they do the most damage, they're just the most beneficial in a pug group where you never know what the DPS are going to look like, but you also have your own DPS to rely on as well. So for that reason, Dissonance is the best. Now, the reason that Smite is the second best is because, well, they do less damage than Dissonance does. They have they have buffs that Dissonance does not. They have 1.5% buffs from Inspiration, which buff everyone in the team's damage. Yeah, it buffs everyone in the team's damage for 1.5 for all stats. So crit, haste, luck, versatility, mastery, all these stats get buffed by 1.5%. Alongside, they get a main stat buff of I believe 200 for Smite. But that's always kind of fuzzy because I'm playing Lifetime so often these days. But yes, because the damage gap between Smite and Dissonance actually isn't the craziest damage gap, um, Smite can pull ahead in the next tier of teams. But for pug groups, having Dissonance's extra damage, especially after the rework for Dissonance with the Run Rhapsody now and not stacking, you've gotten better. Ping Dissonance have gotten damage increases as well as just normal Dissonance have gotten damage increases because of the multiplier changing. Uh, so yeah, basically, Dissonance's damage is the best for a pug group. Smite's damage is the second best. Lifebind's class buffs, or not class buffs, stat buffs are the third best because you're buffing their stats, they're doing more damage, but you're not buffing them enough to where your damage would not matter, if that makes sense. Like a Smite doing, let's say, 400k damage and buffing everyone's damage by like 100k with 3 DPS, that's like a 700k total contribution in damage. Whereas if you have a Lifebind buffing everyone's damage by like 200k, and you have 3 DPS, that's 600k total damage contribution. So you can see like the Smite would put a hell by 100k in that scenario. And then Dissonance, let's just say like you could somehow pull out 750k, which actually is doable. But anyways, I digress. So that's the first tier, where it is Dissonance, Smite, Lifebind, and Concerto. The reason I didn't talk about Concerto is because Concerto is just a buffer, but they kind of heal less than Lifebind and they buff less than Lifebind. So Concerto is the only class that's actually like kind of hurting the season like a lot because Lifebind stole their whole flow. But they're still not completely dead. Like they're still viable and playable. It's just like, why would you play Concerto when there's Lifebind exists? But if you enjoy Concerto, it is not doomed. As for the second tier, which is organized free to plays or organized non whales, basically. Um, Now the reason that Smite pulls ahead in like an organized free to play environment or organized non whale environment is because, like I just said, let's say your Smite is contributing 400k damage and buffing everyone 100k damage. But instead of 100k damage, because you guys are actually organized, have good builds, and do good damage, the buff would be like 150k per se, rather than, or the DPS are doing more damage and you're buffing them, and they're actually capitalizing off of the buffs. Like maybe they changed their stats or something. So instead of 100k, the buff goes to like 150k, etc. Um, Now you're contributing damage while also contributing buffs to your team. Dissonance falls down in this list, and this is actually roughly great. Like Dissonance and Lifebind in this scenario would be relatively equivalent. And the main reason that they're going to be relatively equivalent, or one could pull ahead of the other, depends on Imagines. If a Lifebind has like a T3 Tina and like a T3 Vino with Growth Arcane or Fast Growth, I think now, and some really good DPS who can actually maximize and capitalize off of their buffs, then Lifebind could pull ahead. But if your team is kind of playing like off meta classes, or all their builds don't really benefit off of Lifebind as much or something, then Distance could pull ahead if you're doing enough damage, fully buffed like Food Serum, etc. Um, while also just being able to heal the team and sustain the team, because Lifebind heals are actually just not the greatest. But anyways, so you can do some different pulls with Dissonance that you might not be able to do with Lifebind. But yeah, so that's my middle ground ranking, like the non-whales slash the really good free to plays, dolphins kind of all fall into this category, where Smite could pull ahead because Smite has the 1.5% buffs while also being able to deal their own damage, whereas Lifebind has the 3%, 3% to 3.6% buffs, depending on the raid set. Obviously, I'm not including Ocean Weapon in these, but the 3 to 3.6% buffs for Lifebind, alongside the fact that they have just probably better Imagine Dissonance. Whereas Dissonance, your viability is completely reliant on your damage, because break isn't as good on most of these bosses anymore. Although there are a few bosses where you can get some value out of your break. For the most of the bosses, you're not going to be getting as much value out of your break on Dissonance. So most of your value is tied to your damage, and if you're not outdoing their buffs in damage, then you're not really going to outscale them. As for Concerto, Concerto actually does buff certain specs a bit better than Lifebind, I believe. Like I've heard that Valkyrie actually benefits more from Concerto than Lifebind, although I'd have to definitely go back and test that for sure. But Concerto, just they heal the least. They don't really have any defensive capabilities, and their buffs on average are just worse than Lifebind. So in they're going to be again the worst in the scenario, which is unfortunate, but that's just like how it is. As for whale tier, basically Ocean Weapon, T5 Imagines, probably T5 Human Imagines, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on. Lifebind just becomes the flat out best, because these people are the people who are going to be able to maximize. And again, this is also under the consideration that this is organized play, right? You're not doing M20s probably with a pug team with no communication whatsoever, with no typing in chat. You're probably just going to type in chat like, okay, what are you guys running? What do you need? Da da da. Basic communication at least, bare minimum. So some form of organized whale play. With Ocean Weapons, T5 Imagines, etc. Lifebind just becomes the best, because Lifebind buffs just scale harder later on. The better your team is, the better your buffs are for Lifebind, in short. So like Lifebind could contribute, let's say, 1 mil damage in buffs, whereas your Smite is contributing like a 400k damage, and then like their total buffs contribute to another 400k. So they're doing 800k, and your distance is, let's say you're doing 800, or not 800k. Let's say the distance is doing 750k. Obviously, these numbers are not like 100% accurate, but I'm just giving you guys an example. Basically, Lifebind would outscale with their buffs, adding to the team damage, because Lifebind is probably going to be running like T5 Tina with either T5 Vina or T5 BL, with Growth Arcane or Fast Growth, whichever name you go by, with more than likely Team Luck and Crit as well. And if the Lifebind is really that well, then they're probably going to have Ocean Weapon, which is obviously unlikely, but there are Ocean Weapon Lifebinds out there, which another 0.3% buffs. So 3.3 to 3.9% buffs on Lifebind, with 3.9% like an 80% uptime roughly. So and the biggest thing that I didn't mention before is, at this tier level, most people will either have damage stack, life wave, or be able to have both either a damage stack or a life wave set. And life wave is, with Lifebind, permanent uptime basically, because as you heal in Lifebind, you can permanently activate the life wave with the raid set. So as long as you like actively stay healing people, your raid set should be active and you should be generating life wave basically all the time for your DPS players, which is also a huge increase in damage that a lot of people don't consider because most free to plays are either running damage stack or life wave, but they don't really have good module sets to maximize off of that. And the same goes for like most non super whales because a lot of like dolphins who spend on imagines, etc., are still rocking the what are they called? The free to play modules. Like they're not really spending on modules, so it's very unlikely that they'll have either damage stack or like damage stack life wave, really good sets that really make a huge difference. Um, so yeah, with all those buffs considered, life wave permanent, basically permanent uptime considered, like all these things considered, Lifebind kind of just outscales all the other healers, whereas Smite would be second because the buffs they have buffs, but they're not as good as Lifebind buffs, but they're still good and they're still able to output damage. Another downside of Smite is that they're most likely running Flamehorn to maximize their damage as well, because if you're not running Flamehorn, you're probably not going to be able, or if you're not running a DPS Imagine that's greatly increasing your damage, you're better off being Lifebind than Smite. Obviously, this is like meta level play. I'm talking about whale level, meta level play for M20s, etc. And then Dissonance, while the dissonance healing is fine and the damage is fine, it just does not compete with the buffs that Lifebind and Smite give, unfortunately, because the damage difference between a max tier dissonance and a max tier Smite are not big enough to where dissonance can outscale the buffs that Smite gives. And then once again, coming in last is Concerto. Although Concerto is fine and can be played, it is just not the greatest option. So those are my tier list rankings for all the healers in the Protocol Star Resonance for season 2. Um, if you guys want an in-depth guide on each healer, I can do that. Just let me know. I'll probably be able to talk to some people who play their class at like the highest level as well for those guides. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.